World War II ending. So here we go. Now, as we said, VJ Day is over. And we talked about this. Now, there are two big conferences, another big thing set up. The Nuremberg, I mean, there's so much stuff here. Why does that say Chinese? I'll have to go fix that. All right. So first off, back to the big three, correct? The big three meet a second time. There's actually three conferences the big three meet in. We've already talked about Tehran. If you remember, that's where they decided that we were going to push unconditional surrender and we would help rid the Germans, they would rid us. This conference here is actually called the Yalta Conference, and the Yalta Conference is important for a couple of reasons. Number one, they basically agreed to the formation of what will become known as the United Nations. And number two, and kind of setting the stage, if you will, they actually agreed to divide Vietnam, which is something kind of interesting in Indochina. They agreed to divide Vietnam at what's called the 17th parallel, and then they said the Japanese would surrender to the Chinese in North Vietnam, and in South Vietnam the Chinese would surrender to the British. That becomes in particular importance, especially what happens with China in 1950, which we'll get into, okay? So that's Yalta. Now, as we said, the United Nations were set up. It was set up in San Francisco a little before the war ended, etc. And the whole purpose of the United Nations is to prevent any type of world conflict, okay? And there are many nations in the United Nations, and the United Nations is actually headquartered right now in New York City. That's where they have their big meetings. Now, the two questions coming forward to the United Nations, which are highly debated, if you will. The first one is self-determination. If you remember World War I, we talked about all these new created nations. There'll be new ones created after World War II. And the idea is, who's going to rule them? But a little bit more than who's going to rule them, it was more or less what type of government will they be allowed to have. The United States said the two major players here, later on we'll talk about, two superpowers. The United States were big on democracy, and the Soviet Union was big on communism. And the question was, are we going to force these countries, etc.? And ultimately, for a lot of them, they decided that we would allow these countries to decide their own government. Now, on paper, that seemed good, but the Soviet Union kind of goes against that, and we'll look at that here in a second, all right? Now, here are the ideas here. Within the United Nations, there exists what is called a Security Council, okay? These are the countries of the Security Council. We have France, we have China, we have Russia, England, the United States, the Soviet Union, as they later become known. There's also an issue with China because there's two nations here. We're going to talk about how that comes up with Taiwan, etc. Okay? So the Security Council is an 8-member team, and the whole idea is they will protect things. Now, speaking of protection, the main purpose of the United Nations is called collective security. That if somebody does decide they're going to go and start a war, that if they go and mess with somebody, all these other countries will jump in against them, not necessarily in a war case, but in sanctioning them and not trading with them, and that could potentially hurt their bottom line, which is making money. And so that's the goal of the United Nations, and they still are around today, and they do things. Now, ending the war here real quick, they also decide at the Yalta Conference that they're going to hold the Nazis accountable for what they did in the Holocaust. And so these are called the Nuremberg trials. Now, I personally find it kind of ironic, seeing as how the Nuremberg laws took away the rights of the Jews in the 1930s, that in the 1945-46, when they had these trials, they went to the same site. I don't know if they did that intentionally, but I like to think they did. Now, a lot of the big Nazis actually committed suicide, so we really didn't have a lot of big people on here on trial. The big person we had is this one right here, Hermann Göring. Hermann Göring was in charge of the Luftwaffe. So he's kind of our star candidate that we wanted to get. So the Nuremberg trials are to hold the Nazis accountable for the Holocaust. Okay? Now, they're actually put on trial for what is called a crime against humanity. This basically means it's a war crime, it's genocide, crimes against humanity, and in a really weird thing, and I'll show you this video later on, Robert McNamara says that had we not won, what we did with the atomic bombs would have looped us in against crimes against humanity, and that the president and Curtis LeMay and anyone else who was associated with the dropping of the bomb in that Manhattan Project would have all been held accountable, similar to what the Nazis did. And so, what makes it ethical if you win and not ethical if you lose is a really good question. And we will look at that in video, and we'll talk about ethics in war, and so that comes up after the state test. I'm jumping ahead of myself, but it's an interesting concept. Now, at the end of the war, balancing for power, literally correct, we have Uncle Sam. His initials are what? U.S. with democracy. And we have the big bear of Europe. The bear is to represent the Soviet Union. Remember, they're not Russia. They will not be called Russia again until 1991. And so Uncle Sam wrestles with the bear, and it's about political ideology, communism versus democracy, if you will. All right, one last conference we got to talk about that happens, and that is called the Potsdam Conference. Okay? Now, the Potsdam Conference was unique because what they did is they went into Germany, and they divided Germany into 4 sections. There was East Germany, which was for Eastern Europe, if you will, and that would be the Soviet sector. And then over in West Germany, for the Western powers, right, we have England, the United States, and France. Eventually, it just becomes East and West. Now, something else really interesting they did is that you can tell it here. Berlin is the capital of Germany. It's inside the Soviet sector, and they actually divided that as well. So there is a democratic section inside of a communist thing, and that poses a major problem. Eventually, in the 60s, they build a wall, and so we'll look at this. This is kind of the birth of the Cold War here. We have 2 superpowers fighting over how to rebuild Europe after World War II. We have divided things, and as the story goes, a house divided never stands very long. And so over the next 10 days, next 10 days, we're going to take the Cold War as a whole, starting in 1945 and ending in 1991, and then we'll come back and we'll talk about the domestic things here in the United States. So it's going to be kind of a whirlwind thing. It's a little bit different, but I enjoy talking about the Cold War, how we're going to do it. All right?